joined tonight by three activists from the Ithaca area. Alexis Esposito, born Janae Ramirez, is an Indigenous Taino woman adopted at birth. After receiving her Bachelor's of Music Composition, she decided to dive deeper into her roots as an Indigenous woman. Since then, she has stepped into her work as a birth worker, seed keeper, and farmer. In 2017, she co-founded the Cayuga Lake Water Protectors as a local Indigenous-led environmental justice organization that also advocated for Indigenous rights. She also co-founded the Traditional Center for Indigenous Knowledge and Healing, which she serves as co-director of with two others. Understanding her role as an Indigenous woman, her life's work around protecting the land, water, food, and birth. We're also joined by Josh Dolan, who has lived in Ithaca for 17 years, first moving here to pursue permaculture, education, and environmental activism. Since 2004, first with the People's Garden Project, then Gardens for Humanity, Josh has been involved in food justice and urban agriculture, helping to establish several garden sites over the years. Since 2009, Josh has worked at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Tompkins County, and most recently initiated the Solidarity Gardens Project last year, networking CCE resources and BIPOC-led organizations and households. Josh was also a co-founder of Mutual Aid Tompkins and has been active in the protests here in Ithaca since May. Our final panelist, Christa Núñez, operates an Ithaca-based sustainable agriculture teaching farm and nonprofit, providing educational programming in the natural world regarding food justice for children and families, with a focus on the displaced and systematically urbanized. Her work as a racial equity and sustainability practitioner in Tompkins County has focused mainly on creating replicable models for equitable land governance, agricultural cooperation, youth and family engagement in sustainable food systems. Ms. Núñez's rich connections in the community, built through interdisciplinary collaboration around issues of reparation, literacy, and land access for African diaspora and Indigenous families, form the framework for her experience in building narratives through anthropological and multimedia storytelling. This has shaped the intimate, verite-based methodologies that she employs in her research and in elevating diverse perspectives. Christa's aim is to provide equitable land governance, cooperative farming, and homesteading opportunities to folks who are currently and historically excluded from land, as well as uplift their stories and the stories of their ancestors. Thank you guys so much again for joining us tonight. First question that we have for the panel is, what drives your activism? And whoever wants to start can jump in.
I'll jump in. What drives my activism is just how connected we are, and I think how much it has become visible and absolutely apparent to everyone, not just those of us who do this work, but to the world at large and our community at large, about the needs. There are some real needs out there, and I think if you have a heart at all, it's important for all of us to jump in and do what we can to support people who have real needs in this community.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
I'll go. I think being a parent is definitely kind of how I got involved in activism. Just that sense of like, wow, the world's kind of messed up right now, and I need to try to make it better for my kids. So that's one thing. And then just that idea of solidarity. You know, I've struggled a bunch in my life, and still am, especially in the last year. So, you know, it's kind of like we're all in the same boat. So the more I can do to like build a safety net in my community, the more better off we all will be. You know, like that idea that Christa mentioned of interconnectedness.
I really admire both Christa and Josh's perspective about being parents, because I think that's really, I don't know, for me as an Indigenous person in the community, you know, I feel like a lot of what we do is because we're always thinking about the next 7 generations. So even though I'm not personally a parent, you know, the children and like the future is like particularly important because I mean, you know, eventually like we all go back to the earth. So it's kind of like, you know, we need to be figuring out how we're going to make improvements for society on this planet for the future. And so I just want to acknowledge that and also agree with it. And, you know, for me, my perspective in that sense is similar, where I feel like, you know, my drive to be an activist, I guess, is, I actually probably would never call myself an activist, but my drive comes from definitely seeing a positive improvement for our society and to assist in the conscious evolution of society. And also because, you know, I think about, you know, oftentimes, you know, that our water is now being traded as a commodity, but is in most places polluted. And if we're not taking care of these things, then who else is going to be taking care of them? Who else is going to be having these conversations? So I believe strongly in that, and so I'm willing to have these conversations, and I'm willing to do this type of work in a way that, you know, aligns with who I am as a person.
Yeah, you guys, absolutely. I love that perspective of looking at these issues generationally. So kind of speaking of young people, what are some ways that students can form meaningful, healthy relationships with the work being done in Ithaca without co-opting leadership or becoming an imposition to a community that they are most likely only a part of temporarily?
I'll say, and this is a recommendation. It's been a long time since I've been a student myself, so you know, I reserve judgment for those who are in it right now. But I would say that having been a student and a temporary resident of a college town in Michigan and then in Los Angeles, that the impetus is on the student to take the focus off of them. I think sometimes when we're young and haven't trained ourselves in looking outward and not really making things about us really, but making it about others, I think that's when you can really hit the ground running and have real impact, even though you might be in a place temporarily, is when you look around and see what the needs are. And I think specifically at IC, I'll just touch on one instance of injustice potentially going down right now, is where these mass layoffs are happening and some lack of transparency within the university happening. I think students can lend a voice, even though that their job or future job might not be on the line, but looking at their professors and other faculty and staff and administrators who might be impacted by this lack of transparency and sort of the mass sort of knee-jerk reaction to financial impacts happening due to COVID and other reasons. I think students can lend their voices and focus their service on behalf of other people around them in the locality that they're finding themselves in currently.
Yeah, I want to just build off of what Christa just said about the situation that I see. Like, one of my favorite mantras about activism is just tend to your patch. Like, take care of what's immediately around you first. Like, the same idea as like if you're on an airplane and there's like the airplane's going to go down, you got to put your mask on first. You know, so that's like self-care number one, but also like caring about your like immediate circle of people. But then like, what's your patch of ground? And for students at IC, that's the university and the struggle that the faculty is going through right now. I think students do have an outsized influence when it comes to decision making at universities more so than staff do, because you're the customer. So, you know, the customer's always right. And then in terms of like, you know, taking care, you know, being active in the Ithaca community, you need to be involved in the life of the community. Come down off the hill and you know, check out what's going on. You know, if you want to volunteer, like there's tons of like food outreach work going on with food pantries. You could look into helping Harry-O at Black Hands Universal, or pitch in at Southside or GIAC, or you know, seek out other volunteer opportunities and get your feet wet before, you know, forming your own opinions about what you think should be done.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you guys so much. White savior complex is often talked about when addressing the dynamic between a community and activists. However, savior complexes are not exclusive to whiteness. How can students avoid dynamics of saviorism, and how can they encourage peers to get involved without taking a savior attitude?
I'm going to chime in on this, particularly because I find that, honestly, it's definitely something that comes up in conversation in certain communities about this savior complex, which I think like another word is being like a martyr in a sense. And I think one way that I think is really important to kind of hone in on that and prevent it from becoming an issue, and on being self-aware. I think that oftentimes it's not necessarily always part of the
Oh, I think we lost Alexis there. Oh, back.
Can you hear me okay?
No, you are cutting out a little bit at the moment. We can't really hear you there.
I'll just jump in really quick while we wait for Alexis. And just say that I think anybody that wants to
I'm gonna shut my video off, so I still have okay service. I don't know why that happened. But I think one thing, you know, am I okay right now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Came back. Krista, if you wanted to jump in on this one while we make sure that Alexis has her audio back.
Yep, I'll jump in. Alexis, you're muted. I'll just finish up my thought and then you can take yourself off mute. Hopefully you'll be back. I was going to say that I think anybody that wants to lend a hand, sometimes it's tempting to feel like you have the answer, you know everything you need to know. It's safe to jump in because they need you and they can't progress forward without you. And that is in part true, but I would say be careful to listen and have step one be to really come close to the issue and listen to everyone that has something to say in that sphere, and then do some really conscious assessment work on yourself and see where you land in your understanding and your willingness to participate, and sort of get a feeling for your own ability to engage in this work in your own capacity. And then find ways to ally yourself with folks who are really doing the work and have the most vital participation and can move the needle in terms of real change. But I think the first step would be to listen and to understand that you're one part of an entire whole. And if you look at, I look at organizations in terms of a body and how, you know, I might be the eye or the nose and other people are the kneecaps and the fingers. We all go in to make a whole. And it's important to honor the whole instead of focusing overly much on your own abilities and skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think that Alexis is typing her response. Do we have her back audio-wise? If not, then when her response is typed, I will just read it out. Josh, did you have comments on this one?
Yeah, I guess I can speak specifically about white saviorism. Like, I think one really important thing is being willing to accept feedback in a humble way, and not react when someone says that something that you did might be racist or sexist or homophobic. You know, white supremacy is insidious, and most white people were indoctrinated from a very young age. So, you know, it's okay that you have, you know, those things going on with you, but, you know, the number one thing is accept feedback. You know, if someone is telling you that you did something that's racist, they're telling you that because they want to be your friend still. You know, they wouldn't even bother with you if, you know, it was like they were that offended. And I think learning to recognize those unconscious biases in yourself, but also learning to recognize how our institutions are white dominated, and the way that we do things in the world is really white dominated. So for white people, it can be an adjustment to work in communities of color and the way that work gets done in other communities besides you know, white culture dominated communities.
Absolutely, yeah. How would you confront someone who is unaware of their savior complex?
I think just open communication is really important. And like, definitely holding yourself accountable. It's really difficult to hold other people accountable if you don't do that for yourself. But yeah, a lot of listening and a lot of brave conversation, I think. Being brave about talking to people about what you see as issues, and not just reacting, but like thinking through like what your response would be to a problematic situation.
I think what Josh said is very apt and good advice. And I would add to just have the conversation. I think sometimes when you want to be active in helping solve some real challenges, it's easy to be the nice person and just sort of let things slide. And there's a place for just sort of not getting caught up with fighting with people constantly, but there's also a place for truth telling in order to better the environment in which we work, and also to improve and sharpen one another in positive ways. And so having those tough conversations, I think you can do so in love, not just telling people what they need to change, but also doing so in a loving manner that people can actually use constructively on themselves. I think sometimes we don't train ourselves, and it depends on who we are. I think some of us can speak the truth and just lay it out, and others of us have to really work on that. And there's other people who are really well trained in accepting people for who they are and where they're coming from, but really have to train themselves to speak up. And I think there's a balance that we all have to strike in speaking the truth and also doing so in love.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We do have a response from Alexis in the chat. I think we're still having some technical issues, but Alexis says, I think healing is a necessity in the work of activism. To elaborate, oftentimes the savior complex comes from the desire to help others because you feel your cause is less than important, figuratively speaking. This is for non-white people. For white people, do something when asked, offer help, but also lay low until your help is needed. I think white savior complex in non-white folks is the big expression of their generational trauma. Definitely, yeah. Right. Since the pandemic began, there has been a renewed interest across the nation in what many are calling mutual aid. What does mutual aid mean to you, and what does it look like in Ithaca?
I guess I could start on that. So I, as was mentioned in the intro, I was one of the co-founders of Mutual Aid. It was a pretty large group of folks that kind of coalesced over the first kind of 2 weeks of the initial like closing down of the economy. And it's kind of like since then, it's just kind of had a life of its own. And you know, some of the most recognizable aspects of the work are the blue food pantry cabinets that have popped up all over the county, and you know, that's an idea that's like kind of spread, you know, nationwide pretty rapidly. We also, it's not happening now, but for a while we were doing quite a bit of like direct payments to individuals to help out with expenses. And then the solidarity fundraising that we do, very early on, it was like pretty surprising how much people were donating to mutual aid. And so we decided that we really needed to make it equitable and find other BIPOC-led organizations that were doing meaningful mutual aid work and distribute that funding. And that's something that happens continually month to month. You know, in the last month, there's probably like 8 or 10 different projects that we donated to. But I think it's definitely come from an awareness from a lot of people that the government was really inadequately prepared for the pandemic and the disruption that happened, and people were already so precarious in many cases to begin with. So it really toppled a lot of people's trust in kind of the bigger structures that we have that are meant to take care of us. So I think that's kind of like in that context, that explains why it's become so popular.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really incredible. And Omega did just put a link in the chat for folks to some of that mutual aid Tompkins information, so you guys can check out that link at some point to find more. And Krista, did you have an answer for this one as well?
Sure. I think for me, it means folks leveraging what they have on behalf of others, and it could take a myriad forms. I think for us, we really have been focusing on all those intangibles matching up with the tangible. So with our Quarter Acre for the People project, we have found folks who have land and have expertise in farming or food production, wanting to leverage their expertise and their land holdings with for people who want to access land and who want to have farm and agricultural businesses. And so the folks on the other side who want to participate on the learning side have a bunch of expertise in terms of what they want to learn and the type of labor that they can put forward in planting things and growing things. And I think partnering people with one another in terms of where they want to go. A lot of local farmers want partnership. They want new alliances. They want to do the right thing. You know, they acknowledge that the land that they have was stolen and that it was passed down from generation to generation. And now as the landholder, they are moved to do what is right and to engage people who have been systemically displaced and excluded from land to have a place again. And so For me, mutual aid means it's really about finding the commonalities and how land and food really is something that we have in common, and how we can leverage our desire and our need to collaborate on land in order to support one another and where we want to go in life.
Yeah, thank you. And I love that we kind of have like these different perspectives on mutual aid, like thinking about the pandemic, but then also thinking about like access to land and agriculture and all of these things. Do we have Alexis back?
Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
Our most recent question was about interest in mutual aid. Did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I feel like my perspective is similar to Krista's, and that I definitely need to do like more research on my own to really understand the root of mutual aid, like the history of it, where did it come from, and what else was happening in history while the mutual aid movement began, because I know that the foundation of it is complex. And because of that, I've had a very difficult time figuring out, as a person who is strongly a part of an Indigenous community, how we fit into a mutual aid system. And I say this because when I often read things about what mutual aid is, what comes up to me is these principles around Indigenous sovereignty, and I don't really personally understand the difference. Except I feel like these beliefs in sovereignty come from a very cultural place that also acknowledges the time, that also acknowledges, the history around land theft and oppression. So I personally have I feel like a different perspective on mutual aid. And so in that sense, coming from a perspective of Indigenous sovereignty, one, I think it's very important that support is needed for Indigenous people as far as rematriation and reconciliation goes, because of the history of land theft. And in that same vein, I do believe that the movement around reparations is equally as important, because many of the people that come from a history of slave families, they didn't choose to leave their homeland. So they were stolen, and they were forced to come here, and now they're here. And so in that sense, and maybe in the Indigenous community, my perspective might be a little bit, I would say, radical as well. But in that sense, I feel like, our Black brothers and sisters are also very much so, they deserve land here. It's not like, there's land for them in Africa. And I think that, anybody who might have some sort of thoughts around that as an Indigenous person is also perhaps, I don't really think that that's moral and ethically right. So I do think that the conversation around land access is essentially important in the conversation around mutual aid. But otherwise, it's about supporting each other and making sure that your neighbors have what they need. But in that same vein, to also support people who perhaps might, I'm just saying this because there's some conversations that have come up locally around mutual aid, and certain mutual aid initiatives and people who are a part of that community, and questions come up like, do people who care about mutual aid also support people who are abusers, or who support people who have been sexually harassing people? These questions around I would say community accountability come up, and I think those things are essential parts of the conversation. I probably could go on a lot longer for this. Sorry, my connection's really funny. I apologize.
No, that's okay. The joys of technology, right? But
yeah.
That thinking about accountability and community and all of these connections is like such an important part of what mutual aid is, and what all the different forms that it takes. I do want to pivot a little bit, since this is the MLK celebration, to talk a little bit about a certain Dr. King quote. In his work, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King writes of the summer of '63 in a way that parallels the questions asked about this past summer. He writes, "Why did this revolution occur in 1963? Negroes had for decades endured evil. In the words of the poet, they had long asked, why must the blackness of nighttime collect in our mouth? Why must we always taste grief in our blood? Any time would seem to have been the right time. Why 1963? When you think of the activism and pressure of this summer amid a serious health crisis, we can think about the recent work with mutual aid as well. How are you answering the question as to why now? And have you seen any demonstrable change in how the community engages with your work?"
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. I am seeing a lot of parallels between 1963 and this summer. And I think for me, it's about storytelling. I think it's, the idea when Emmett Till's photograph of his mangled and mutilated body hit the newsstands, and America got to see what he looked like after he was beaten and killed by those men, I think was transformative. It's something that the African American community knew deeply, profoundly, innately, but it's something that America suddenly woke to, that there was this violent, deeply violent and hateful thread that had persisted through slavery, through Jim Crow, through segregation, and came bubbling up to the surface yet again there with that child's murder. And I think similarly, when we had the George Floyd video come onto social media and receive so many views, when that young lady videotaped the officer kneeling on his neck for several minutes. And when people saw that, I think it really, again, said, this is happening. This is something, again, that our folks knew what's going on. We know police officers murder Black people regularly and with impunity. And so I think, there's instances in our history in this country where folks see it becomes like this, and suddenly folks kind of wake to what's going on. And so I think in my work, it's really been sort of, not funny, but shocking and interesting how we've been having conversations for months and years now, wanting to engage, different funders and different entities, and trying to widen our net, and suddenly the phone is ringing off the hook, and everybody wants me on their board, and everybody wants me on their panel, and it's really funny. And I think I'm not the only one that's experiencing this sudden excitement around this work. This work has always been in place. I've been doing this a long time. People have been doing this work longer than I have, and suddenly there's this interest. So I think what I'm seeing is that people need to see what's going on. We need to tell the stories of what's going on. We need to amplify and create larger platforms for people's stories and their experiences to be heard, so that this doesn't just kind of fall beneath the radar again and we go back to normal, and really nothing really changes. As we saw with 63, we saw some change, but obviously not enough because of where we are. So for me, let's tell our stories, let's keep people engaged, and let the truth be told.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the bit about storytelling. I think that that's such an important part of getting renewed interest into these issues, is sort of making sure that they remain. Josh or Alexis, did either of you want to answer this question of why now?
I think one thing that comes to mind that I feel like should be not covered up by all of the politics around this pandemic is climate change. And I say that because I remember, I don't know how many years ago, because my sense of time has definitely been a little bit off. But, you know, I remember as, you know, the conversation began to really start, as far as kind of like more of the general population around climate change and the temperature increase of the global heat, and how many things in the permafrost were thawing, and including, you know, certain species of unknown viruses were in the permafrost and still are in the permafrost. And these are the things that I think of when, you know, a pandemic like this hits us, kind of like, you know, I guess we were kind of like side blinded in the sense where it happened so quick. And although it was unexpected, in that sense, I feel like there has been a bunch of other red flags as far as, you know, the actual change of the entire global climate. And it's really important to not lose sight of these things, because I feel like there's been so much controversy around whether, you know, COVID is a hoax, or, you know, we have all of these QAnon conspiracies, you know, that are going around. And, you know, I personally right now, like, I don't entertain any of it, because so much of it is just so inflated as far as certain mentalities go, let alone whether or not actually any of the information has any credibility, you know, but just the actual mentality around it is just not respectable. So I feel like it's really important to bring the conversation back to climate change, because if we don't, then when else is something going to happen to really gain the attention of our human society as far as the dire straits that we're in on this planet?
Yeah, I think you know, Trumpism definitely played a huge part into it as well. Like, you know, voting rights have been being eroded for decades, but particularly since the, you know, parts of the Voting Rights Act were struck down, and you know, it was very clear to folks on the left, like, if you put everything together, it's really clear that Trump was a fascist, and a lot of his followers were fascist, and the things they were doing were fascist. So I think there's just like this innate energy in society that when the pressures become too great, there has to be an outburst. And so between Trumpism, the pandemic, climate change, the economy, we have this perfect storm this last year, when there was just an eruption of like social movements, and you know, as we all know, those social movements are always happening. It's just, as Krista said, sometimes there's that, like, you can't ignore this right now moment, and so that's where we are.
Right, absolutely. And I think that, you know, with what all of you have responded with, you know, the stories that we have to tell going along the way, and the building pressures, and the issues like climate change, which build up for a long time before they hit a flashpoint like this, that's what gets us to these moments. How do you talk about the relationship between white supremacy and American capitalism as it relates to your work?
I'll jump in. I guess, you know, the powerful are always going to seek divide and conquer strategies, and white supremacy has been a very effective way to divide society for hundreds of years. So in terms of capitalism, you know, fascism is you know, the linking of corporatism and nationalism. So when those two things are operating in tandem, it basically, and like anything that stands in the way of that needs to be destroyed. White supremacy doesn't care about liberalism. There's, white supremacist ideas are, people that promote them want to debate them in the marketplace of ideas, but really there's no place for those ideas. They need to be kind of crushed whenever they pop their heads up, and we're really at a crisis point right now.
I'll just jump in and say I think there's a connection between white supremacy and capitalism because of two reasons. I think capitalism is really about the leveraging of resources to gain power and finance and money. And if you look historically, the resources have been allocated to the folks who could outgun and outman others and hoard those resources for certain communities. And I think when you have capitalism, which seems to evoke the idea that any person with resources and ideas can succeed, it's a false premise, because if you don't have resources and you lack access to resources, there's not a place. And in terms of freedom, the idea of, I am free to think of all the great ideas in the world and make some money off of them. Freedom to what? For me, it's not just about freedom. It's about I can be free to make as much money as I possibly can, and then strategically use those resources to exclude and disempower groups of people, and use my freedom to enrich myself and impoverish others. And so I think those two things are just go hand in hand because of the exclusive manner in which capitalism has been released in this country. And I think specifically, you think of, I hear people say, well, if Black people would just dream bigger and work harder, they could achieve these dreams. But when I go into a bank and somebody says, well, you need to come back with your paperwork and you need to have a signature from your CEO. And I say, well, I'm that person. And they go, oh, I thought you were the secretary. You need to come back tomorrow with your T's dotted, your I's dotted and your T's crossed. And the assumption is, and then when finally I get in there and I talk to a loan officer and they're like questioning my ability to repay a loan simply because of how I look, the whole question of freedom and, the equality intrinsic to capitalism is called into question. And so you realize that it really is just a white supremacist system masquerading as freedom.
I definitely think that white supremacy and capitalism are inseparable, because they both operate on this perspective of kind of like one thing is better than the other, or like I am better than you type of mentality. My understanding of, I feel like the economy is one inseparable from the environment in which we live in. And I believe in capitalism as an extractive economy that's based on, basically the trading of resources for money. And typically the money goes into people who are already wealthy in that sense. I definitely feel like that capitalism isn't built to benefit the people who have been victim of genocide and slavery for centuries. I think that if the system was built that way, then it wouldn't be benefiting the people that it's benefiting right now. And I feel as, the wealth gap becomes larger and larger, it's kind of impossible to really argue that capitalism isn't separate from white supremacy. And for me, it really just goes to kind of like some of my teachings in the sense where like we as humans are part of nature around us, and we're no greater than the next thing. And to think that we are would be kind of like a mistake of our own humanity, which we make, but it would be a mistake that has a really dire effect on the environment around us. And we've made that mistake. And so we're seeing this play out in many different ways. But if we don't figure out a way to, kind of battle white supremacy and the mentality that goes along with it, because I feel like white supremacy is also just as equal in danger as, like the patriarchy, to be quite honest. And so I feel like these are really essential things that need to be broken down in a way where, one, people don't feel attacked, and also everybody understands that we all have an equal role in our society. But to expect that somebody is going to gain something from a certain thing that is around us is just going to keep, keeping everything out of balance. It's such a hard thing to really eloquently say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a perfect expression of that really intense connection between those concepts. Is there a difference between accountability and redress?
For me, yes. I think redress is about, I'm married and I use the analogy of marriage for a lot of things. One of them is in relationship, and I think everything is a relationship. You're never accountable until you look at redress, and you can never redress something until you're accountable to it. And I think the idea that you can acknowledge what's happened and just move on, or you could acknowledge what's happened and how it's created an atmosphere of inequality, of distrust, of fear, of pain, and then say, what can we do to make it right, and actually invest time and energy and everything that's needed to make a change and heal. But you can't really do that until you acknowledge, and you can never really acknowledge fully until you make a decision that you want to make something right.
Yeah, I guess we do live in an age of conflicts. It's everywhere around us. And yeah, without acknowledgement, there's no way to move forward. Like without our government explicitly acknowledging a history of white supremacy and all that comes with it, like we can't really move forward. And without that acknowledgement, we can't institute solutions like reparations or land back or things like that, because we have to acknowledge the scale of the hurt that was caused, whether it's like like a microaggression all the way to like macro, like a genocide of a whole entire people. The scale of the redress has to be commensurate with the hurt. So I'm a big fan of like restorative justice and confronting things head on. And I think also I'm a big fan of consequences when, especially people in power, cause hurt. And until there's consequences, you know, particularly considering current events, I don't think we can really move forward in a, like, you know, a healing manner, or come to a place where we reach unity as a people.
Right, and I think especially with the recent emphasis on unity, that's such an important point, is to talk about that. Alexis, did you want to comment on this question?
Yeah, I definitely ask myself this question pretty often, especially feeling often in a leadership role in many different platforms, because it's important to hold people accountable, and it's important to make sure that a situation is changed when something has happened that shouldn't have. And I feel like oftentimes what it comes down to is our general set of morals and ethics as humans. And oftentimes I really do feel like that's been lost, and, you know, along with common courtesy. And I feel like we really have to kind of start from the ground up in order to really be able to hold somebody accountable. And I do feel that holding somebody accountable is essential in doing any type of activism work, but doing so in a way where, one, you're not making enemies, and two, you're creating a positive relationship with the person that you're holding accountable, and that relationship is founded on trust. If trust doesn't exist, it's very difficult to really kind of do anything. So it goes back again to just kind of addressing, you know, what simple ethics and morals are in our communities and in society. Because I mean, when we really look at the world around us, like it's pretty bastardized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that these points about, you know, what's going on within our communities actually lead really well into the next question, which is, we all know the saying that Ithaca is 10 square miles surrounded by reality. In truth, Ithaca is a town that leans culturally and politically liberal while being surrounded by communities that are more conservative overall. How does this climate impact your organizing, if at all? And what advice could you give to students seeking to navigate this cultural landscape, which may feel very different from their hometowns?
I'll jump in. I think for me, it's about really assessing the commonalities, because our farm is sort of on the border. We're in the town of Ithaca, bordering on Enfield and Newfield, and all of our neighbors, we're sort of on the outskirts of that liberal bubble, and our neighbors may or may not be as liberal, and I don't want to even use the word liberal, but might not have been taught or been exposed to the truth of the value of my life, and the value of others' lives outside of that external, that border bubble outside of Ithaca. And so I think for us, it's like, when we do education and we do outreach into communities beyond Ithaca, there's so much that we do to serve inner city and more city-oriented communities that is the same in terms of what is needed out in the outskirts. And so, you know, everybody needs to eat. Everybody experiences scarcity in different ways, and everybody wants to understand the truth of the matter and get to the nitty-gritty of what divides us. And I think finding the common ground between us, while still helping to elucidate what divides us in truth telling, in ways that could be understood and embraced, by people who've been taught otherwise, is our work. And I think I'm encouraged by, I mean, I drive the country roads around where we live, and I see a lot of Black Lives Matter signs that where there were none before. And so I've been encouraged. There's been a lot of work done before we got there, and there's a lot of more work that's happening now, and there's networks and coalitions forming to I think catch up the folks that have been just sort of hanging out there, struggling and not understanding, having no Black and no Latino, no Indigenous neighbors, intentionally so for a long time, but it's been so far gone that people just don't understand why they're so removed and so isolated because of their forefathers' deeds. And so I think I'm seeing a lot of, I see a lot of hope with regard to partnering and collaborating with people who might not be in that liberal bubble, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize too that New York is one of the most segregated still states in the country, which kind of focuses the spotlight on that land question. So I think like the work that Christa's doing and Alexis, it's just so important that that everyone has access to land. My work is more focused in the urban space, but yeah, as Christa said, there's so many issues that that kind of cross across all political the whole political spectrum. I will say though that you know, there has to be a line somewhere of like what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so I feel like I'm like still like having a hard time coming out of like a very defensive mode of activism where you know, it's like, especially like in online spaces of like protecting the community. I think there are a lot of people out there that have like pretty like hateful and evil ideologies, and so there's, you know, number one, awareness about it, and number two, vigilance, and you know, so like deplatforming people and institutions that don't have people's best interests in mind is really important, and also that, you know, education, like I agree, like there is a place for like respectful dialogue and finding common ground with people, but when people are like openly spouting white supremacist viewpoints, you know, there has to be a hard line somewhere of what's acceptable and what's not. I might not be the best authority on how to speak to people in those places, but at least with our online communities like the mutual aid space, we're really vigilant about just having a zero tolerance policy about that kind of like hateful ideologies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of gets back to what we were talking about in the previous question, right? With accountability and like where can we unify, and then but also what are the things that we need to be vigilant about in that way. Question for all three of you. What do you envision for the future of Ithaca as a community? Broad question. Whoever wants to go first can.
I actually like wrote this. I audited a Green Cities class years ago up at Cornell, taught by this guy Rob Young, and I actually put together like a mini newspaper that was like Ithaca 2030, and it was kind of like my utopian vision for what Ithaca would be. I have to admit, at that time, like racial justice wasn't necessarily like something that I was super aware of back then. So I think if I had to redo it now, I would be really focused on like land access and creating opportunities and education, popular education for communities that are traditionally left out of our systems. I think I heard people talking about Kirby Edmonds before we started, and I just wanted to refer to his work, really bringing that equity question to everything about, you know, Ithaca's planning for sustainability. That equity question needed to be front and center throughout. So I think that's something that I think needs a lot of attention.
Yeah, can you talk more about that for folks who don't know as much about the work that you're referring to?
Kirby was really, towards the end, was working a lot on like the Green New Deal and how it would be expressed in Ithaca, and how at each step of the equation it was, you know, the question of how are Black and Brown community members being included in this part of the plan. You know, how will they be employed in the system? How do we create more opportunities for people to get involved in the decision-making process, in the visioning process? You know, at every step of the way, that was like the first question was how can BIPOC communities be engaged in this process, whether it was like ideas or plans or jobs. And of course, the Green New Deal is all about, you know, creating jobs that are, you know, will have a positive impact on the future of the planet, whether it's like, you know, from very, you know, easy pivots to like just like weatherizing homes to, you know, installing solar panels to building green homes to, you know, farming and agriculture. And, you know, every part of the economy can be green somehow. So, yeah.
Just to dovetail off of that, I appreciate Josh sharing that important work. I think I envision everybody having a little slice of land and food plants growing. I envision children and families having a stake in their own food production and an understanding of how things grow. I envision people being connected. I envision the legacy of Kirby Edmonds living on in how we live in an ecologically sound way amongst one another in community with one another. And I envision ways in which we communicate that are free from deceit and lies that have been strategically publicized in order to divide. And I see ourselves protecting ourselves in ways that support community and a diverse connection between all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Alexis, what do you envision for the future of Ithaca as a community? We may have lost Alexis for a second, that's okay. So if students want to get in touch with you or your work, how can they reach out and contact you? And what are some good sources for people to find out about activity in Ithaca, like protests, direct actions, and gatherings?
Josh, why don't you?
Yeah.
I'm going to type some stuff in the chat.
Yeah, I think the Mutual Aid Tompkins Facebook group is a really great resource for just learning about the breadth and depth of the mutual aid work going on in Ithaca. There's also a lot of like community education stuff that gets posted on there, news stories, etc. As far as like getting involved in protests or movements in Ithaca, I think you know, things are kind of like in a little bit of a lull right now. I think there's been some intention to pivot towards more like working on some of the institutional stuff around, like particularly around police reform and abolition. So I wouldn't expect there to be much in the way of like protesting, especially we don't protest much during the winter here in Ithaca. But I guess a good site is Black Hands Universal on Facebook and CNY Black Lives Matter. I can type those in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a bunch of links and email addresses popping up in the chat right now. So for our participants, our audience members, if you're looking for that information for how to get in contact with our panelists, with their organizations, with some sources for information, you can refer to those. We did get a response from Alexis in the chat regarding the future of Ithaca as a community. Says, my vision in short, the Cayuga come home. They have land, their rights, and space in this community, along with everything else Christa and Josh said. We do have another question. How can you deal with or heal from constantly witnessing performative activism around you, especially regarding issues that affect you directly?
That's a great question. I would say address it. I think the constant piece is really apropos. I think the performative piece is extremely divisive, and I think calling people on and really asking what they're doing as opposed to what they're saying is important. I think words and action have to go hand in hand in order for anything to really happen in the realm of healing and unity, which we all seem to be calling for these days. And so asking, what are you doing? You know, it's a simple question, but, you know, requiring a response that's real, I think is what's going to help, you know, get folks over that hump of just saying what they think that people are expecting them to say, and actually putting some meat to the bones of their plans.
I think it's really important to keep constant pressure on any institutions that we're involved in. For me, I work at Cornell Cooperative Extension, and we've seen varying levels of interest over the years around social justice issues, but when they do arise, it's really important that we try to find meaningful ways to address them rather than just performative or solutions that kind of gloss over like more rudimentary issues. And again, if you see individuals around you that are, especially friends, that are engaging in that type of behavior, I think it's just a matter of confronting it directly and with honest, open, and compassionate communication.
Could I add, exactly what Josh said? I think compassion, but also like not being afraid to say, okay, this is what you're doing. You're having conversations and you're talking about things that you've never talked about before. That's great, but that's not enough. Not being afraid to say that's not enough. In our work with land access, we're realizing land access is not enough. It really is about shared governance. It's about dignity affirming ways for people to interact with the food system and with land. And it's about shared, we lean away from the word ownership, because who can really own land? We're going to be long gone before, and the land will still be here. Can you own something that's going to outlive you by millennia? And was here long before you were. But the idea of shared governance and power behind that access is what we're really grappling with, and how that really calling ourselves and others on what's enough, and what to you is enough. And if you can go further along those lines, I think is an important conversation.
All right, absolutely. Alexis, did you have thoughts on this as well? I don't know if Alexis still has the phone connection. If not, then. Okay, we do have a couple minutes left. If any of our audience members had questions that they wanted to ask, we can do that for a few minutes.
Alexis had something in the chat.
Yes, there we go. Also, most important, as an activist, you can't be afraid of having enemies. Stand in your truth. It will only align you with people who also stand in that same truth. Absolutely. Thank you, Alexis.
Yeah, if you've made enemies doing your activism, like could be you're doing something right.
Yeah, make enemies for the right reason though. But yeah, that's true.
Okay, if we have no further questions, I think that is going to conclude our panel tonight. I want to thank our three panelists again so much for sharing your time and your experiences and your knowledge with us, and for sharing your thoughts, and wish everyone wellness. And thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.